I'm Alicia Dolce. I'm the executive director of the Connecticut Green Building Council. It's one of the hats I wear. And I've heard Beverly speak before, and most recently in conjunction with Connecticut Green Building Council's upcoming NESB, Power of Place, Climate Action and Justice in the Built Environment. It's a virtual summit that's taking place next week, March 25th and 26th. Beverly, along with 4 other panelists, will be presenting a very compelling session entitled Affordable Housing, Saving Money and Energy While Addressing Climate and Equity Goals. In addition, peer-to-peer Susan O'Dell will also be a featured speaker, showcasing a session along with Carla Butterfield, who I believe is on this call this morning, on their award-winning Columbus Commons affordable multifamily project in New Britain, Connecticut. So Beverly Craig. Beverly manages the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center's low and moderate income programs. Recent programs she has launched include the Passive House Design Challenge, the Affordable Clean Residential Energy Program, and the Triple Decker Design Challenge. Beverly comes from a background in energy efficiency and renewables at nonprofit Homeowners Rehab, Inc. And while there, she achieved a 22% energy reduction in HRI's affordable portfolio and helped install 9 PV systems and 5 solar hot water systems. Beverly holds a BA from the University of Southern California and an MPP from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Thank you so much, Beverly, for joining us this morning, and take it away.
Okay, so first, it's great to see so many familiar faces. Doug, I've been working with for a project that will maybe one of these days start, and Darian, of course, and of course his colleague Christina is on the affordable panel with me. Really great, amazing things Win is doing. Kai. And actually, Mike Brown, you have the name of a HERS rater we deal with a lot in Massachusetts. I don't know if you know that. So who does a lot of passive work too. So great to see you guys all. And so I'm going to just talk about sort of like the history and evolution of passive multifamily in Massachusetts. So like the backstory is like 3 years ago, we had one building, this picture right here, the Distillery North, 28 units in South Boston that was certified passive. That was it. A bunch of small, single family and stuff, but really nothing of scale and not really a lot of work in multifamily. And right now we have at least 106 buildings that have started with a passive house feasibility study and passive house modeling. We don't know all those will certify, but my guess is in the next 3 years, we may be seeing about a third of the new construction multifamily be passive. And even if maybe some of them will be close to passive, but I think a lot of them will actually certify too. And so that's a dramatic change. And like, how did it happen? And so as I do work for the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. People get us confused with Mass Save. So we are not part of the utility program. We are a state quasi-governmental agency, much, much smaller, like 50 people. And it's our mission to try and encourage the clean energy economy in Massachusetts and hit the state's climate goals. So I guess I would characterize us as doing everything nobody else is doing. We have a big focus on offshore wind, a big focus on workforce. We do a lot of internship program funding, and buildings is another big piece, and then grid modernization are sort of our 4 major areas. So I'm in the buildings area. And so first action we saw in multifamily passive in Massachusetts was a stealth passive project. So Hank Keating, who's an affordable housing architect, worked for Trinity for years, had built his own single family passive, decided to spec these townhouses, 18 townhouses between 2 and 9 units, basically to the passive standard without telling anyone. So the air infiltration's right, all the modeling stuff is right, like heat recovery, ventilation, and it turned out to be all electric. So all heat pump water heaters. And he was able to do that. He didn't call it out and was able to get no incremental cost from what they usually build. So that's not saying there was no cost. I think there was some shifting around from like landscaping, maybe finishes to get it in at that price, but obviously within a range that he could basically hide it, right? And one of the things that I thought was genius about what he did is he pre-funded New Ecology to do 5 years of monitoring reports on these. And you just don't see people do that, right? I mean, and if you're looking for examples of all electric buildings with a lot of maintenance or monitoring information, this is like your gold mine. I have those, you can look at them. But here's what we basically found. We were lucky because after a year of sort of stabilizing the property, the numbers look very similar to this. So the blue are the different townhouses and how much energy use intensity. And then 2 years before, there were 3 LEED Gold townhomes built by a different architect and GC on the same property. So it's a perfect benchmark, right? Perfect. And look how different. And we all know LEED, you have a great architect who's very focused on the envelope. You could probably get in the range of some of these passive house numbers. But in this case, look how different it is. So that's stretch code compliant here in Massachusetts, right? And LEED Gold. So we were seeing that, and we were also hearing the story of Pennsylvania, which I know you guys all know. Their 10-point bonus really led to a lot of new construction, and they were not seeing a lot of additional increases in costs. So you've probably seen Tim McDonald talk about, it was between 2.5%, and sometimes it was even below the median square foot cost estimate going in for low-income housing tax credits. And so then we started doing research. Tim had been very active in different states trying to get passive house in low-income housing tax credit QAPs for the ranking of what projects. And he'd been very successful in getting mentions, but not as successful in getting a differentiation between LEED and enterprise green communities. And basically what we saw looking over that is when it was just mentioned as an equivalency, you got no passive projects. It was only when there was a differentiation, so some kind of bonus points or some kind of weighting that gave you preference or extra funding, that you see the passive house affordable projects under low-income housing tax credits. So we knew that was going to be important, and so we reached out to our state credit tax credit agency, DHCD, and said, let's do what they did in Pennsylvania. And I think Tim had been trying to reach them for 3 or 4 years and gotten nowhere. And we got nowhere. So basically, they thought it's going to be way too expensive. Every incremental dollar for efficiency means one less unit. You know the story, right? It's sometimes a hard sell. And so we said, okay, what can we do to actually get some projects and prove them wrong, that it's not as expensive as they think? And so Mass EC, our board put up $1.7 million to do sort of a passive house design challenge to try and get folks going in for low-income housing tax credits to design and certify to passive. And we provided up to $4,000 per unit if they'd go for it. And some of that was early design money, some at pre-certification, and some at the very end. So we funded 8 projects, 540 total units. And the goal here was just to see if the incremental cost could be below 3%, which is what we thought it would be, based on what we'd seen in New York City and Pennsylvania and other places, and just really track those incremental costs very closely. Because we do think there are incremental costs. I do think there are incremental costs. So a couple resources that could be helpful for you is, Alicia, you were mentioning the need to get developers and owners to think about passive house. So our first attempt was just to show there's a lot actually out there in development or finished. And so this first webinar is just sort of, it's a short overview of what's different about them, a whole bunch of case studies and sort of things that have been learned. I think one is that you have to pay when the building's closed in and the mechanicals aren't up. There can often be a serious humidity problem if you don't plan for dehumidification, things like that, right? That if you're doing it the first time, you might not have thought about yet. And then we recognized that we didn't have a lot of GCs that were familiar with passive, and there might be some need for training subs and the GCs. We didn't expect them to actually go through the builder's training. I mean, we'd love to see that, but for our 8 projects, we wanted to just do as much as we could. So there's like a spreadsheet tool that basically for all your subs brings out questions that you might think about as either the design team or the consultant on the project about what you want to tease out that might be different from a normal project. So I think some people use it, some people don't, but it's helpful to look through just to make sure you're addressing all the issues that might be coming up and anticipating them in advance. And both of these are available on our website, but also on the Passive House Mass website, which is where I would say the central hub of all the passive information in Massachusetts is on. So 9 months later, the Mass Save program, which is the real money in the state from the utility funded, ratepayers funding that goes towards efficiency. Mass Save basically replicated our program, slightly less generous, so $3,000 per unit, but something that I had not seen anywhere else in their program, which is this upfront planning money. So they provide 100% of the cost up to $5,000 for a passive house feasibility study, which anybody in Boston has to do LEED certifiable. So it slides in real nice with your initial design charrette, basically paying for half the time to be more detailed on energy and for the time of all your people to be at that charrette, right? So it's nice. They also pay for 75% up to $20,000 per building for passive house modeling. So obviously very attractive and trying to get the whole design team to go for it, right? And the owner. Then if you actually certify, you get $3,000 per unit. And this didn't just happen in a vacuum. Passive House Mass and the climate activists in the state had been pushing for 3 years that the Mass Save next 3-year plan would include something about passive house. So it was just really good timing that we ran our program 9 months before and gave them a good model that they could replicate. And that is what has really changed the numbers. So, down in 2019, there was that one project, and now we're looking at, this is 102. I know of at least 4 more projects that have enrolled. So just, the hockey stick of adoption. And we'll see if it keeps on this track or more or less, but it's pretty big market transformation. And they weren't the only people working on trying to encourage this trend. There's also, the state has an Environmental Policy Act, and I would assume most states have this too, like larger projects trigger this, so larger multifamily projects, where the state, they have to do an environmental impact statement, and the state can require certain things. And the staff there were very active in pushing passive house. And so we got a bunch of projects sort of more open to that before the incentive even came along, including some that aren't in the multifamily space. So our first office space passive is Winthrop Tower office space, which Kai, I think, knows, because I think Stephen Winters is on that project. And so first couple projects, right, of our 8. This one's built, Cambridge Finch, 98 units, occupied as of July. I think it won the FIAS Best Affordable and Best Project this year. And it's a fantastic site. Once we can actually visit, you guys should definitely come visit, because it's also got, it's got a lot of really cool stuff involved there. And so 1.4% cost increase. So this is a little deceiving, I would say, because the architect was the one who did the first one and probably came in with, I think, a lot more on shading and thermal bridging, avoiding thermal bridging than most architects would for their base case. But still, that being said, it was only a 1.4% increase above what they had planned before. And in terms of what were the most expensive things, and you'll see this across all these examples, the fresh air to every bedroom is the biggest change in all cases. And it's interesting because that's actually, our code is moving towards that anyway. So it won't deal with the common areas in the stairwells balanced ventilation that passive requires, but a lot of that incremental cost is going to go away in a few years as code catches up. And windows, you always hear that too. But interestingly enough, the second one, which is under construction right now, 135 units POA is doing, windows were not higher here. So the interesting thing is they went to triple glazed windows, but this project was bid by Delbrook a while ago because they went through, I think, 3 tax credit rounds before they got funded. and then they moved up to passive. And the windows, there's a very nice webinar, which I'll point you to where it is, where Delbrook's cost estimator goes through every change, like major change from going from the base case to the passive, and what the cost estimator thought it changed the numbers after talking to the subs. And the windows, they were going to use double glazed high performance windows, and with the exterior continuous insulation, it was just a really fussy detail. A lot of carpentry, a lot of wood. And when they went to the triple glazed, I think they went to Alpin with like an extender, it slides in a lot easier. So Delbrook said it was cost neutral to them because the labor and carpentry is so much less. So I think there's going to be things like that we learn as we do more things that can help bring some of these incremental costs down. This is much smaller in Gloucester. Similar types of increases and categories of costs. 2.8. This is Old Colony. So this is, I think, a little not typical and probably higher cost because the first floor, FIAS required them to keep the first floor in the passive house envelope but it's run, there's a health center and medical facility on the first floor, both which are very high energy use intensity, and they're all very small studio seniors. So that makes it more challenging, right, to hit the passive numbers. So I think that's a little higher than we're going to see on average. And then this one, Dakota's doing, and the underslab insulation, that's definitely one of those differences I think we'll see, especially in the more, like, I think the Boston projects have to do that actually, but that's one of the big things. And their base case for the heating and ventilation was very simple. So usually I see reductions in the HVAC, but the ventilation is more expensive. But in this case, even the heat pumps, because they were more complicated, were an add compared to their base case. And so, I mean, all these so far, and not all of these are built, right? So there may be change orders along the way that will affect the costs. But they're all below 3%. And when we talk to the GCs, they all say this is like really within the normal swing of what we see anyway on these projects. And so I think the folks who are getting familiar with this are realizing that over time, as they get more experience, this is going to become easier and easier. And just like LEED, when first introduced, was a huge premium and came down with experience, maybe we can see the same thing, except where materials or thermal bridges or shading are much more expensive. And then we did finally convince our tax credit agency to put in a bonus. It's pretty modest, only 2 points out of, let's see, I can't even see, 182 points above LEED and Enterprise Green. But between that incentive and this bump for low-income housing tax credit scoring, this last round that they just awarded, 2/3 of the new construction projects are going passive. So that's half the story, right? Like the cost side and how hard it is and getting experience, that's half the story. The other is, are you really getting the energy performance that passive is promising? And from the modeling compared to our base code, we tend to think we should see around a 40 to 60% EUI reduction all in for these buildings compared to stretch code. And so, of course, our projects aren't far along to have even stabilized or had a couple of years of performance. So we will be monitoring that, but we started looking at other places. And so one of the obvious places is Philadelphia. Has energy disclosure ordinance for 50,000 square feet and above for multifamily. And so we pulled out the tax credit properties that have been built within a similar time frame and similar sizes. And there's only, unfortunately, it's a small sample, but the two passive buildings, the EUI is very low. Then the LEED ones are sort of mid-range, which is sort of what you would expect, but a lot of variability, which I think we tend to find. And then the code ones are all over the place. And honestly, I'm a little suspicious of some of these low ones because I don't think they have the tenant plug loads in there. But even considering that, the median difference, we're talking about significant, over 50% between the code and the passive. So that's a really good first start. Of course, it's just a first start and it's a very small sample. And then I think Stephen Winters and Bright Power New York City just yesterday had a presentation about this. It's been out a little while. They've been doing a study similar in New York City. And I don't think, so they had 6 buildings that they called passive like. I think only 2 are actually certified. But they had enough data on those to compare to the post 2003 median and the pre 2003 median. And so really the thing to consider is that post number, right? The 73 median compared to all these other buildings. And so they didn't actually, if they had hit the passive house target, they would be even lower, but a big range, but again, sort of in that range. So 32 to 58% there. And so I'm very much hoping they'll be able to update with more buildings that are actually certified, because I think there are more years now. So something we all have to do. But obviously, all of us need to start reporting our data in a central place. And I think Stephen Winters has actually been very helpful with SUNY schools. City, I don't even know them, but I guess they are trying to collect performance data on multifamily in New England in one place. So I do encourage you, if any of you guys have worked on a project that has a few years, to try and get them to report through this website, because we need more examples. So finally, the last thing I'll say is there's a lot of great passive house education for clients, architects, engineers, like everybody you could possibly imagine through our Mass Save program and Passive House Mass. So the central place is really to go to the Passive House Mass website, but they have been funding half the cost the way that NYSERDA did for a while for individuals going for their certified passive house consultant or builder, any of the basically formal certifications if you're a Massachusetts company. And so we've seen a lot of uptake on the more formal certification accreditations. And then so much great content. It's almost like too much. So what I tend to do with our affordable clients who are doing it for the first time is I try and tease out my favorites. So I'll just mention briefly what my favorites are. So Michelle Pigian, who's probably the most experienced architect in Massachusetts with Icon, she has a really great one. So this was on her 3rd one, where she is starting. She thinks that one of the biggest places where you might get problems is in sequencing with subs. Like the details are just more complex than they're used to. And so you can get in field and realize that something's been done in the wrong order. And so her solution is to use 3D drawings with color coding and to use the 3-week look ahead to go through the sequencing for all the subs. And so she's found, even in this last project, the Harbor Village one, it's only 30 units. The GC doesn't know at all what they're doing on passive, but she's had less problems with that project, not even trying to really educate them, but only using the 3-week look ahead and like early inspections on like your electrician and your plumber, anybody making penetrations, to make sure, you know, the first attempts are never good. And then you get them to do it right and know how to essentially report, and you can get there. But anyway, I think, and I even put the minutes on there that I think are the most critical. So, and then I mentioned the window thing, that's in the cost estimating for Passive House one. And they're like, when they first started mentioning Passive House, the subs all went through the roof on their changing their cost estimates, but they did some great education. Like they did an envelope one for the subs and then a mechanical one, and talked through the specific details and what was different. And the cost came way down again. And I think some of it was like a comfort level that the standard wasn't going to just get thrown over the fence and with that no help, but that they were going to get help all the way along. And then just understanding what the difference was really made a big difference. David Salaman from Pennsylvania has a really great one on avoiding common mistakes in passive house projects. I've seen Prudence Fiera with BR&A do a similar one with some of the same content. Those are both really good. And then Stephen Winters did the advanced construction workshop series, that's really great for subs and GCs. And they can just pick out the ones that are relevant to them, but it's super good. Then, you know, for your bells and whistles and new technology, Tim McDonald's always fun to watch because he tries out lots of new things. I thought the front flats one, this pipe in pipe approach for heat pump water heaters was really interesting. And using Minutair also. So you know, the bright shiny stuff doesn't always last, but it's sometimes fun. So those are my favorites. And there are more, way more really good ones. And I encourage people to look at that. So that is it for me. I'm wondering, I would love to take any questions. I don't see any hands, but I can't see.
I just think that we may be getting some energy efficiency grant money, and I don't know if you're part of a larger organization that does, you know, talk to people in Washington about, you know, working this into our agenda.
Yeah, and I mean, I was mentioning to Dean too, I think Connecticut, maybe Eversource in Connecticut is starting to do more training stuff. Like, I'd encourage you not to replicate exactly what we have and just link to it instead and find the gaps. Like, there's not enough MEP content, I feel like. I think that's one of our weak spots, and for structural engineers, and also like cost estimators, like from different GCs. They just don't really understand enough. So those are 3 gaps that I could talk about, but I can put you in touch with the people in Passive House Mass that try and figure out what we need to do in the future. But I think both on a national level, policy-wise, and the local education stuff, we should coordinate more.
Okay.
Yes, we can
Yeah, we
hear.
do have a bunch of
we have
raised hands. They all look the same. And so I'll just take them in the order I think I saw them. So Kathy Dorgan, maybe you go first, then Alicia, Doug, and Seema.
Yeah, first of all, this was really great, very helpful and very interesting, and, you know, very important to share forward. I love your idea about coordinating more on training and content. Can you mention some other thoughts you have for all of us in Connecticut interested in moving forward for energy efficient design? What are some other things we should be thinking about?
So do you guys have a systems benefit charge that goes into an energy efficiency fund?
Yes.
So how is it designed, how that money goes out? Is there like a 3-year plan, or like a board that decides how much goes to affordable, how much goes to residential, commercial, new construction?
Yeah, there's an energy efficiency board that dictates how the funds are allocated, and we do have a 3-year plan. It's pretty similar to Massachusetts structure.
So I think that's where big money is, right? So, and new construction to me is the easiest sell to the utilities because it's easy to measure, and like single family assessments and insulation and stuff, there's so much, it's small scale and it requires so much marketing that gets burned up in non-measures that sometimes like a program like this is a really attractive thing, and you might not have to, you can sell to them, you might not have to put this kind of money in the long term once you get the ball rolling with the new construction market, right? And I feel personally, even though I think retrofits are more critical to us in the long term, the technologies are going to only be developed and scaled up in new construction to be adapted. So when we see energy sprung in Europe and the panelization movement, we don't have it yet for new construction here. Like, it's at least not in Massachusetts. And so high performance panelization and modular, like we need to get that down for new construction. And that's where the volume is that they'll invest in that kind of stuff. And then we can have the high performance panels that we can put in, you know, New York retrofit style, right? So I do think, even though I think it's the easy thing to do, it's also important for other areas. And it's a fairly easy sell with utilities because it's easy to measure the difference. So they may not be sold yet. Like, honestly, the Mass Save program had terrible numbers going into their 3-year. When they put together this program, they had almost nothing confirming what savings would be. But we're going to see more of that over the long term. And if they really do find 40% consistently better than code, that's like some of the cheapest savings they can fund. So it shouldn't be that hard of a sell if we can get those performance numbers. And unfortunately, I just don't think that's collected systematically right now. And that's a real problem. And
Yeah,
Connecticut,
that's definitely something.
yeah,
Sorry.
the QAP for Connecticut, I think, is really unfortunate because those bonus points, I feel like, first of all, the effort to track incremental costs in the Connecticut LIHTC projects was horrible. Like I think the GCs threw all ventilation in, and that's not accurate. And then a bunch of the projects were rehabs, which the costs are just a lot higher. That should not be averaged into the average cost. So I know the Connecticut Tax Credit Finance Agency thinks it's super expensive, but I think it's partially because they did a bad job of setting up how to track. But, you know, hopefully with other, and I honestly don't know Connecticut, what your stretch code is. So, you know, it may be that that's the difference too, is that the base, what you can get away with for your base is so much lower that it is a much more expensive. I don't know, but I can't imagine that it's the 10% that they say it is. I just can't imagine that's true. Either they have very inexperienced first movers, or the retrofits, or they did a bad job of tracking the incremental costs.
Okay, so thank you, Beverly and Kathy. Alicia, you had your hand up? Or you have your hand up?
I do. So do you put my hand down, or do I have to do that?
I think we'll just
I
leave
have
it
to-
up there and just.
Okay, I'll put it down when I'm done. Still, like I
Okay.
said, still learning the tech tools. Yeah, thank you so much, Beverly. Every time I listen to you, you always add extra things that I catch. You're always adding new information to this conversation. And I actually did want to talk to, my question actually was about cost. And because I had heard you say earlier that, you know, there again, lessons learned as more of us are doing this work, you know, and learning from other states. You know, you had brought up this point about making sure that you isolate those things that are just for passive house versus, you know, like what's required, for example. And I noticed in a lot of your earlier slides, you would use the term base case. So I just wondered, is there anything that you can share? And maybe this was what you did in the Passive House Design Challenge, but did you have a special sort of a rubric for how this cost differential reporting, you know, needed to be made so that, you know, you were able to clearly see, you know, because obviously you were tracking, right, the upcharge for passive house. I think that there's benefit in that learning, because I don't think there is a consistent tool that we're all using, and anything that you can share would be really helpful.
So if you go to our page at Mass DEC Passive House Design Challenge, so one owner, HRI, was willing to share the detailed spreadsheet, which has every category of cost and every change order. So in their case, they were far enough along on this. They had everything bid and they changed, and then they had a new price, right? So it's very easy to isolate the incremental cost categories. So that's a good spreadsheet. And I could give you the one that's not filled out. That's part of each of our contracts. Some of the other ones, so like Beacon at Old Colony is not comfortable with that level of detail being shared. And so it looks more like a slide like I showed with the major categories, and then much more definition around what the base case is. Of course, the base case matters a lot. And we didn't say what the base case had to be. It was more so that we were aiming at the tax credit finance agency, and what they cared about was what would the incremental cost be compared to what this developer would have done otherwise, right? So some of these are in Boston and trigger Article 37. There are a lot of requirements on the envelope there you wouldn't see in other parts of the state that are stretch codes. So like Taunton, right? Or Dakota Partners is in Hanson. There's one in Holbrook. Like those have stretch code, but they wouldn't have like the local planning department looking in detail at their lead documentation on envelope and pushing them further, right? So it is specific to what they could have gotten away with in that location. And of our 8, I think 5 had at least one round of primary numbers on a base case that was different than the passive house, right? So those are really easy because you have an early number and a late number and you see what changes there were. The ones that did not do that, they started designing from the beginning at passive, which actually is probably a cheaper way to design, right? Like, because you're doing it from the beginning. It's harder to tease out the incremental cost there because they have to go back and say, oh, what could we have gotten away with, and then price it, right? It's a little tricky to get them to do that. But if you give them all the categories and you ask them, like, so every time people they put all the passive house consultant and the passive house rater in as extra costs. But I have to push them a little and say, well, what green consultant would you have had to do for enterprise or lead or whatever you would have had to do for your tax credits, and back that out. And on the passive house rater, what would you have to do for HERS rating, right? Like, so I push them on that. Like, if you don't have someone being the librarian and like standardizing, it's just going to be random what people put in and don't. And then I usually have to push on the mechanical systems because they don't want to really price that difference. And ventilation always is an additional cost. And it's really funny because some of these GCs in Holbrook think they can get away with operable windows, and I'm like, I really don't think the tax credit agency is going to let you do that. So like maybe 2 years ago, you could get away with that. You can't do it now.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is this pushback, and it doubles in the details on this. And honestly, a lot of our affordable owners probably were good actors to begin with and probably have a better base than if you look at just market rate. Affordable in Massachusetts has been sort of on the leading edge of green building for a long time. So, and they're long-term owners, right? So they're a little invested in the final use.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't know if anybody has any follow-up questions to that, but yeah, that was some of the detail that I was wondering about. And I think you said that there is sort of a blank spreadsheet that it's on the Mass CEC website. Okay. Because I'm
the blank one's not there. I can send it to you, but
yeah.
The filled out one for the Finch project is there. If you just click on the 1.4% increase, you get the whole detail of every change order in every category.
Thanks, Alicia. Doug McCleary, you're next.
So I have 2 questions, and thanks, Bev. This is great. And the questions are kind of unrelated. So in Massachusetts, I see that you've kind of staged the money. You've upfront consulting and modeling, and then kind of at the back end when everything is successful. How important is that staging been in getting people to want to try it out?
I think very, very, very important. And we'll have to see how many certify. And actually there's a little twist. The Mass Save money, that $3,000 comes in 2 parts also. You get 500 per unit at pre-certification, and then you get the balance at final. And there is a fallback. Say you're trying for passive and you need to value engineer at the triple glazed windows or something that makes you not hit passive. You still get double the new construction incentive under the regular programs, which is higher, a good bit higher. It's nothing like the $3,000 total, but it's at least it's a fallback. So I like that they designed it that way, since passive is pass fail. I think that gives people a little bit more comfort.
Less risky.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that I see that as a really good part of the model to kind of push, because a lot of the a lot of it's pass fail. So if you get to the successful end of the project, you get certification, you get everything, otherwise you get nothing. So that inherently doesn't seem very, like a good thing to try the first time. So thanks. And second question is, are you aware of any surveying of tenants of these passive house projects versus others? So we hear the story that living in a passive house is a heavy lift for tenants, and in particularly low income tenants. I don't think that's fair, but is there anything that is showing that these, what the level of satisfaction in these buildings is versus what some of the other
So the Cambridge Finch one that's occupied since July is going to do a ton of surveying. And also they have monitoring on every possible thing you could imagine, including indoor air quality, so in a year or two, it's going to be really fascinating. And I'm sure they'll be presenting at NESE. So keep your eyes on Building Energy Boston for that. You definitely hear anecdotally, I guess I've heard several New York City finance agencies, both market rate and affordable, say they love to finance passive multifamily because occupancy turnover is much lower than what's in the pro forma. And so that must mean there's some satisfaction higher, whether it's comfort or noise because there's triple glazed windows being lower, or indoor air quality, or I don't know, like
money?
Yeah. Well, but I don't know, most of those, they're not paying their own, I bet.
Yeah.
So if
Right,
it's
so that's-
affordable, so that's interesting. It's interesting. So in Massachusetts, they do not allow sub-metering of VRF. So almost always these are going to be central VRF, which is really sort of a hard sell actually for affordable because we have no cooling allowance, right? So what would have been a through wall AC or a window AC that the tenant's paying for suddenly becomes the owner's cost. And that's, maybe it's not bad now, but in 15 years, we can imagine it's pretty bad. So, but I don't think that's true in New York City. Most other states allow for sub-metering. They call it sub-metering of coolant or something other than electricity so that it doesn't become a utility sub-metering issue. But we got to get over that in Massachusetts. It's just like one of those fly swatter issues that no legislator cares about.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Next, we've got Seema.
Beverly, this was really nice webinar. Thank you so much. And I represent Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, who puts out the QAP. And we are really looking to learn. So right now, our baseline is Energy Star, and we do require, extraordinary cost related to passive house. So we specifically say we are looking for incremental cost up against our baseline, which is Energy Star. And we usually see extraordinary costs for windows, for HVAC, and that does include ventilation and insulation and stuff like that. And it is usually just a portion of the overall cost because that's how we ask the development teams to submit. And you'd be surprised, we do get in double-digit numbers. And sometimes from repeat folks who've been doing passive house. So it's not their first or their second project, yet we do see double-digit numbers. And I'm curious as to why would we see something like that in Connecticut? I mean, the only thing that comes to my mind is maybe because these are like, 1, 2-story construction. That's why they may be that high. But we really want to learn. And this time around, we are really looking for, post-construction, so monitoring requirements. And I would really want to know about what we can do in terms of education for the GCs and subs, and how can we get projects to succeed. So anything that you could share would be great.
Sure, well, we should talk more. And I'm sorry if I was harsh, but.
No, not at all. It's perfectly fine.
I'll warn, so Pennsylvania even has backslided because they put in the last round, I think it's almost the same or maybe the same number for DOE's zero energy ready, which is really not the same as passive. And in fact, I mean, I think in Massachusetts, we have to have roof solar ready. So a lot of this is, it's not the same. So I think they're seeing way less passive in this last round, if any. And then I don't think the people who were in the passive movement there have retired. So I think there needs to be a new education effort at that agency as well. And they should have more monitoring data. I don't understand why they don't have more they've had projects.
Yeah.
I mean, and I guess that's like the key thing is all projects need to start reporting their performance measures, because their actual performance, because it's not, theoretical is not the same. And I think we got bit by LEED, right? Like everybody thought LEED was going to solve all our problems. And then it's been so variable. And especially in urban sites where you can get all the sustainable site points basically from just the location.
Right.
It doesn't mean the envelope. It's only when you luck out with an architect who's really into that you're going to get good performance. So yeah. So I think it's good to be skeptical, but it's inconsistent to me with Pennsylvania's case, with New York City, what I hear in New York City, and what we're seeing in Massachusetts. So there must be something about the way that it's being asked or generated or the types of projects. You're right, though, smaller projects probably will have higher incremental costs the bigger you go. Well, and I think that's to a certain level. Honestly, the high rises in New York City to me seem like a nightmare building science wise, but yeah, but we're talking like up to 5 or 6 stories. So
Okay, so I would like to touch base with you maybe
Yeah.
offline sometime. If
that'd be
you
great.
could get, yeah. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We do push
Terrific.
back.
Thanks, Seema.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry?
No, I just wanted to say, Beverly, we do push back anytime we see these extraordinary costs.
Right.
And if, 60, 70% is even attributed to passive house, we push back each time. Are you sure? That's the difference. And
Yeah.
sometimes we do get the numbers tweaked, but we do get high numbers.
And I mean, I think there's some of this is like our first movers are some of the best base cases to begin with. So maybe it's not quite fair that it's under 3%. And also, I do think the first time people do it, the soft costs, like the architect's more willing to do things that they don't actually charge for to get the experience. But I do think with experience, it also comes down too. So like, I think those will wash in the long term.
Yeah, that's what we are really striving for. A lot of education and training opportunities so we can get there. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you, Seema. Darian, you're next.
Hey, Bev, thanks. This was great. And I feel almost guilty. So when development, we had one of your grants awarded for a project and we couldn't make it work. And so the numbers came in somewhere around, we got $750,000 in additional grant proceeds. And we estimated the passive house cost would be between 1.3 and 1.8 million. And the project was tight. It had some structural issues, some anomalies, and we couldn't manage that risk on that project. So the idea that a 3% increase is, I think, representative, like you said, of the best projects teed up that can really move forward without complexities. And yeah, it's interesting seeing this evolve. And unfortunately, I think that we weren't able to participate because we didn't fit within that kind of narrow band. I'd also say, I mean, existing buildings, I don't know what kind of data you're seeing, but QAP for a type of project that is comparing passive house on new construction and then an existing building, it's totally different. And that's really important to note because the costs are, and technically, removing thermal bridging from existing wall, floor assemblies, like
Yep.
It's very complex.
No,
So
I agree 100%. And it's very unfortunate the QAP in Massachusetts does not differentiate between new construction and, you know, rehabs, or even adaptive reuse. It's really absurd, honestly, in the green portion of it. And the Mass Save program, I mean, you and I know, Darian, like lean's been great, but it's like so shallow for existing buildings that maybe it's making our job harder to get to net zero by 2050 because they've done all the shallow stuff that pays off easily. And now we're left with the really expensive stuff. So that's a problem. And I think my personal opinion is the lean program. Well, I mean, hopefully we'll get a climate bill in Massachusetts pretty soon that changes the utilities, you know, goal from cost effectiveness to greenhouse gas emissions. That will help. And then I really think they should pull back the lean program so that it's only at major investments. So at refinance where you can do deeper work instead of shaving off all the low hanging fruit. So.
yeah, I totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yesterday, someone earlier, maybe the person from HUD was talking about, you know, discussions in DC, but yesterday I spoke with Senator Wyden's office. He's the chair of the finance committee, and talking about Passive House as a potential pathway to get a LIHTC boost, similar to the qualified census tract, gets a 130% adjusted basis. If you took existing buildings, you know, going through a 4% LIHTC deal, and were able to give them, you know, significant bump in the basis and adjust that, meaning more tax credit equity came in, that would really motivate developers to solve for Passive House on existing buildings. So I'm hopeful that concepts like that find their way to the right people, and that you know we find more resources, because I like that, you know, you're able to show 3%. It's like that's manageable, or it's manageable for some projects. But there's a whole, I mean, most of our infrastructure is existing buildings that we're renovating and trying to bring up to a better standard. And it's much more complicated, much more costly.
Totally agree. 100% agree. This is the easy part.
Yeah. For the 3%, what does that equal in a cost per unit? Do you have that number?
So yeah, I mean, so Darian, you know, people play games with on budget, off budget. So I know the $4,000 we provided is not enough for even the 1.4%.
Right.
So we did not fill the gap. The hope is that and the $3,000 that Mass Save is doing is not filling the gap. Although I think there is a very significant difference in cost per unit in market rate and affordable. Just you all know that. So, but I still don't think it's not plugging the entire hole, even if it's, you know, 2%. But hopefully the savings or the, you know, resilience benefits or the comfort or the tenant health, or I also think there's an argument to be made that these buildings should be more durable because they get many more building science eyes on them than the average project. When I was at HRI, we'd come in all the time with refinance projects planning to just do baths and kitchens, and we'd find rotting sheathing and you know, mold and insulation. And it was because not enough people were looking at the air barrier and the vapor barrier and making sure, and maybe we still don't have it right and we're gonna have problems with that, but I think there's a lot better chance when you have these multiple eyes checking that the construction verification, that is key. Like, you know, I think when you guys do a great job of construction verification without doing passive, so your projects probably will perform in the best without the certification, but that is not true for everybody.
Well, I'm glad you think that. It's mostly true. I've got a few things like everyone has, but yeah, I agree. Quality control is a co-benefit of Passive House.
And I know you guys did a Connecticut EnerFit attempt. I don't think EnerFit works quite well yet. Like, I don't know, we need more rehab to passive-ish levels to understand what we really should be aiming for, I think. as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I want to follow up on something quick, and I'll get to you, Mike, from Darian. Kim Stevenson from Connecticut Green Bank asked me to mention what you just mentioned, Darian, about the federal bill that's heading through through Congress right now. And she was approached by a guy named Bill Kraus, who some of you may know, CW Kraus Preservation and Development. I put his company and contact information in the chat because he's looking for people from the peer-to-peer network who may want to support, to provide support for this bill going through Congress. And so he has information on it. And I can send out the email to all of you, but if you want to jot down the number and reach out to him, if you're interested in helping him support this. And I think it's a near-term issue, right, Darian? It's happening. Yeah, they want to increase the tax credit from 30% to 30% from 20%, and remove the requirement that the federal HTC basis be deducted from the LI HTC basis. And so it could be a substantial benefit to what we're trying to promote, which I think
it could be, and just to clarify, there's an existing 45L, which is a $2,000 tax credit that's available for new units to market, and it has to meet a 2006 energy standard. So it's not passive house, and it's relatively easy to meet. The current bill changes that to a $2,500 tax credit, and it doesn't increase the performance standard. But it does fix the eligible basis, so it's not conflicting with tax credit basis. And so in that sense, new affordable housing built through LIHTC could qualify for that $2,000 or now $2,500 tax credit, but it's not like a game changer, and it doesn't address anything with existing infrastructure at all. I mean, it's helpful. I'm not going to say it won't help, but it's nuanced. So I'm happy to talk more with anyone also who's interested.
And I work for a state agency, so I can't lobby, but please use my slides anytime you want.
Great.
Thanks, Bev.
Okay, thanks, Beverly. Okay, Mike Brown from McGrath.
Presentation and very helpful and informative. Question: in Massachusetts, has there been any of these projects that you've touched on that have used panelized, or modular construction as part of their practice?
Well, I shouldn't say that. So almost all multifamily does panelization, but I would call it's just like the bare bones of panels. It's not high performance panels, right? So National Lumber will put together something, and it does decrease how much carpentry time you have on site, but it is not what I would call a high performance panel. So none of the 8 that I have done use panelization. I know POA looked at it for that Mattapan project, Blueprint Robotics. And I know people talk to Bensonwood a lot, but I haven't seen one yet.
Yeah, we've been involved with a couple of projects in other states that have used that, and the panelization has certain benefits, but then a lot of what we find, not only with that, but even with on stick built, is the crews on site.
Yeah,
and it's all over the board, especially teams that are working on their first or even second projects. A lot of education, a lot of quality assurance and control needs to be utilized on that. Otherwise, it's some problems. The other thing in Massachusetts, you talked about Pennsylvania and PHFA. We do a lot of stuff down there as well. Not collecting or reporting on the cost and energy savings data from these passive house projects. Does Massachusetts require more of that, and is it done in a more robust fashion than PHFA?
the 8 that I funded, I required them to have either energy scorecards or WegoWise tracking. And that includes all in. So if they don't have tenant data or aren't required to report it as of energy disclosure ordinance, they have to collect that and give it to me for 3 years. So stuff that I put money into, I can do. I think affordable housing projects in general, it's like the finance agencies that tend to require that. So Darian, you probably know better, but like I think Mass Housing or MHP might ask for it, more the lenders, right? Then
We're talking about energy performance data or a breakdown of costs in construction?
Both.
so I think the utility, I'm talking about the utility data after it's built.
Well, in real time, when as a company, we're going through a new process to look at what utility budgets were set at during construction or pre-development, and then how we're actually performing, in operations. And for the most part, we're within a range that's acceptable, but for some, there's a huge gap. So I don't know if I don't think agencies are super focused on that. I think it's the deal, the owner, and it's sort of inherent in the owner's responsibility to get it right, or else the budget's off and you got to figure out
Right, it's an
why it's
asset
off.
manager's job. But
Yeah.
I don't think, like DHCD doesn't even seem, I don't know. I don't think they collect that at all, but I do know like some of the lenders do ask for it because it's part of their underwriting, like that they, I don't know. But it's not systematic. I think that's part of the problem as,
Yep.
and I will say, so we are going to continue to have a problem, especially in retrofits in Massachusetts, where the gap between the price of gas and electricity is so huge. I don't know if it's as dramatic in Connecticut. That's got to change, or we're not going to have the right incentives. And, I think in Massachusetts, at least, we're living with some policies that were set 15, 20 years ago to encourage gas use. And they haven't pulled them yet, even though we're in a different situation, because they wanted gas as a transition fuel away from coal. But that, it's horrible when a single family owner on oil gets insulated through Mass Save and gets an upgrade, but it goes on the electric bill right now. That's absurd because we're just making electricity more expensive. And like Mass CEC's fee is only on electricity. It's not on gas or oil. That's stupid, right? I mean, if you want to electrify all your buildings, that's just dumb. So there's a lot of things like that. And the distribution costs for electricity in Massachusetts is like some of the highest in the nation. And why is that? Like, I haven't dug into that, but it's stupid. We don't have smart meters. We don't have, there's no explanation other than DPU has just been letting it happen. I don't know. So, and we have gas infrastructure replacement costs in the Boston metro area. It was originally $9 billion. My guess is it'll be double that when they actually do it. When do ratepayers start paying that? How long do they get to depreciate that? That'll change the price of gas pretty significantly, I would think. So, and then if there's ever a carbon tax, right, or indirect carbon tax of some kind too, all that could change that gap. And I think you just need it in striking range, gas and electricity. And also offshore wind hopefully will bring the cost of electricity down some in Massachusetts too. So there's hope. It's just, there's a lot that needs to change on the policy and on the state level for us.
Okay. All right, thanks. And then Paul, still now?
Yeah, mute. Hi, thank you, Beverly. I agree. This has been terrific. So, as an architect here in Connecticut, I actually work both in Connecticut and in Massachusetts. And and I've also done a lot of research on construction costs as it relates to passive house and comparing that against our current codes. And that's part of the tricky part of this. Here in Connecticut, we do not have a stretch code, okay? So and to your point, in Massachusetts, that stretch code can vary slightly depending upon your geographical location, right?
Yep.
So, but even with that said, the passive house project I had in design and up in Methuen, Mass, compared to what I see down here in Connecticut, was like a 3 to 4% difference in cost. Okay, it wasn't the low 1s or 2s that I love to see here, but they were definitely in that range. And I do suspect that, to Seema's point, she's seeing those numbers, but that's not where my numbers are, right? And I've got about a half a dozen projects. They are in development. I've got a couple of them in the queue. So I'm seeing that, but I think when we evaluate the savings, unfortunately, we're only talking about electric savings, right? We're not talking about some of those things you began to touch on, which is the resiliency of the building, right?
Right.
Our life cycle on our products are much better than some of the ones that are not in there. We have much less maintenance on these buildings. And these are other factors that I think need to come into the savings. When you're talking about the overall cost of a passive house project versus one that is not, I think it's a much bigger and a much broader question. And my question in all that is, do you have any research from anyone coming in, because you've obviously got several projects that talk about some of those long-term life cycle savings? Have you seen any of that data? Because I haven't.
We're too new, and actually, I think maintenance is higher in a lot of times. So like filters need to be changed more often. A lot of times they're more complicated. Like a VRF is more complex system that needs more preventative maintenance and check-ins, I think. And you definitely hear the New York City owners and maintenance companies say, compared to like easy P-tax, that the ones that they're operating now are much higher for them cost-wise. So I don't think all the categories you said are savings necessarily, but I don't have we just don't have very many projects that are very far along. So like we don't have any going up to 15-year refinance or.
But when we're designing a passive house project, in many cases, we have much less mechanical equipment than in a building. Right. And we don't have, like in a 40-unit building, someone might put 40 condensers out there. Okay, we would have like 2 or 3, and they're larger, fine. They have filters, fine, but we don't have 30, 40 pieces of equipment that have a life cycle on them that are different, and that other larger single piece of equipment is much more sustainable, right? In the long run, it lasts as long. You can fix it and easily repair that, as opposed to more of these other ones. So okay, that's fine. I just wonder if you had any additional.
Yeah, I wish I did, and I wish people were studying that. The harder to quantify things like, durability and air quality and things like, and putting numbers on things like that, but I haven't seen anyone do that yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks, Paul. And that's the last of the questions, the hands raised that I see there. But I did have a couple comments myself, Beverly, picking up on what Paul was just saying and a little earlier what Darian was saying. So in terms of, I loved your point about the building science is so rigorous in the QA, QC part of this whole effort. And I think that people historically, that's one of the things they push back on, is that expense within the process, right? But what expense is it offsetting? And I think there's potentially two. There's one, a normal, whatever QA, QC process would be for a development. And I've been working with a couple of companies on the West Coast who, it's quality performance, I think I can't remember what their names are, but they're they do this work for developers in terms of callbacks, callback reduction, insurance premium reduction. There's a bunch of costs that they invest in this QA process and they avoid otherwise. And so if the QA process is so much better potentially on a passive project, is there a way to monetize that delta? And I don't think we've talked about it a little bit in the P2P. I don't think we've seen that yet, but it's an interesting one that's happening in real time as the project is being developed and built out. But then on the back end, when you begin as a developer, I suppose, to begin to build out your capital plan for 15 years, or if it's like whatever your time period is, what do you plan to do in that period? What are your recurrent costs? What are your, once every 10 years, once every 12 years, once every 15-year costs? And what does passive house potentially replace or make moot some of those costs? Would be another interesting study to look at. Do you have to do these 5 things that are normal capital maintenance and improvement plan would include, but with passive, you don't, because you don't. And I don't know what the answer to that is. Have you seen anybody looking at anything like that? No, okay, so
And
that's
as a
something we might try to.
practitioner, capital needs assessments are pretty useless. I've never seen them be anywhere in the range of what really the costs are.
What it really costs, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it depends, I guess, how long your financing is and when you're
Maybe
gonna
I'm
sell.
Hey,
maybe
Dee.
I'm just, yeah.
Can I jump in
Sure.
for a second? So I do the did the QA/QC for Dakota's Griswold project, and I'm on the Hanson project, Beverly, doing the QA/QC. But I try to ask a lot of questions while I'm there, and the site super on the Oak Tree Village project, anything that he had a problem with, he really addressed, like with building science, because he said, we own these buildings for 30+ years. I want the occupants to be happy, because otherwise we're running to their apartments every day trying to mitigate something. So he right out of the gates, he said, we don't want that. So how can we do this better? And he would stop everything to figure out a better process, right? So that the occupants in the end would be satisfied, and maintenance would be easier because they have to change the filter. So they changed locations of where, their equipment was, so that they didn't have to climb on, the tenant's stuff. So they really were very thoughtful. But I feel like it's because they own their project for such a long time that they want to make it very seamless for everybody. So I look forward to working on the Hanson project, because that same site super is going to be on that project, and we're already going over what we could do better as a team.
Yeah, and I think you'll hear Bronwyn at PHI talk about passive is about building better, right? And when you measure, like running those blower doors much more often, when somebody knows they're being watched and that they're going to be caught, like they do better work. They do better work. So, there's that principle. I think there's like a name for it, right? That if you're being watched, you're gonna and held accountable. So that, that's, to me, that's one of the most valuable parts probably. And also just that the modeling, which I do think there's some problems. I think we're designing for weather now and not 15 years from now. So we're probably under thinking about cooling and shading features. Like you'll hear Monty, which that's, if any of you are architects, Monty, I think it's still available. RDH, Monty from RDH did a series called Passive House Patterns. So if you're an architect, that's like seminal work is the patterns literature. He basically did it for passive. It is so good. And architects just eat it up. So that was not supposed to be available for the long term, but the last time I checked, it was still up. And it's a fairly big commitment, but it's so good. So if you need to convince an architect, have them watch a little bit of that. But he talks about that. Those are some of his biggest mistakes, is that they didn't think about cooling enough and what it would change to be.
Yeah, okay, so that, whatever germ that started, we've got more hands raised. So Doug, you're next, and then Alicia.
So yeah, I think the good point about QA QC for us as engineers, we have learned that working on projects that get good QA QC reduces our risk. We have exposure on any project we work in, so we are always looking for what's the next step in good quality control on construction projects. So we started with Energy Star when Energy Star started putting eyes on a project, twice during the construction process, well in advance of what the codes were doing. So we're always looking for that next step. And it's interesting, trying to monetize that for developers is really hard. So I think that was a good point, Dean, I think you made, is how do we do that? But for us, it's often a make or break. Is this a project that we want to get involved with on a risk perspective? And we see these very strong building science projects you know, and those programs and processes that are involved as being, you know, a clear path for us to follow.
Doug, I'm
Terrific,
curious.
okay.
So Peterson Engineering, who's probably cornered the market in most of Massachusetts for MEP passive affordable, James Peterson will often say he loves to design MEP for passive because he can count on the base heating and cooling being at least 40% better than what they would do otherwise because of all that QA/QC. So he can downsize those mechanicals. And he says running like the WUFI modeling, he says they're never off by more than 10% on the heating and cooling loads. You know, the plug loads may be wrong, the hot water loads may be wrong, but he feels really good. Like he can downsize significantly and not fear being sued. Whereas with a lead project, unless he knows that architect's gonna really be good on QA/QC and really emphasize that and not switch around the points at the last minute to value engineer out things that should be done for envelope, he's gonna put a 30% cushion in there. And we all know that's a problem, right? Like, I mean, both for upfront cost and operating optimally. So do you find that too, or do you feel the same way?
Yeah, because I agree that, you know, we model things, right? And we design systems to handle predicted conditions. So the better, the more confidence we have that predicted condition will actually happen in the field, the more confidence we have in our calculations and the tighter we can make them. So absolutely, you know, this whole, you know, the engineering field is so risk averse that they have for years, you know, put in extra margins to account for other people not doing their jobs. And it's so good when you don't have to do that.
Alicia, follow on?
Yeah, I do have a specific question, but Beverly, I'm so glad that you know Doug asked the question and then in your answer you referred to James. I remember sitting next to James Peterson at a affordable multifamily passive conference that was held, I would say now 2 or 3 years ago in New Hampshire. Boy, does that bring back some very, very nice memories. Because it was Connecticut Passive House Mass, and Passive House Maine. And we were so thrilled to do this sort of 3-way, you know, dedicated conference on passive affordable housing. And Tim McDonald was our keynote speaker. And I'll never forget it because that was the moment where just listening to Tim speak, I sort of got that, I saw the light and I was like, wow, you know, I knew that I loved passive house for single family, but the wonders it could do for affordable multifamily housing. So I sat next to James Peterson. So I'm now going to call him because you gave me an idea for something. So I always say that passive house is a contact sport. And I think this kind of dialogue that we're having today just really proves that. But my question is, I wanted to hop over and look at your recommended resources, because you went to the trouble to kind of give us cues for where we could drop in. And I want to make sure that people on this call know where to go. And I Googled, for example, cost estimating for passive house. And it did take me to the Mass CEC website, but it's just the information about the event. So I'm wondering if the recordings live someplace else. And
Yeah,
if you
so
don't know the
Passive
answer to
House-
that, yeah,
no,
just let us
Passive
know
House-
later on.
If you just Google Passive House Massachusetts,
Okay,
there is a video library.
okay,
Anything Mass Save or we have done is accessed through there. You can get through there. So that's like the central place to go. The cost spreadsheets that I was talking about for our 8 projects only live on our page. So that's, you would just put in Passive House Design Challenge, Mass, and you'll get to our webpage that's about our 8 awardees and what kind of incremental costs they're saying. You click on the incremental cost for Finch and you'll get the detailed spreadsheet.
thanks.
And you can email me too. I think my number, let's see, I think I had it way at the beginning. But I'll send these slides to Alicia so you have it, and she can give out my info too.
Terrific. Was that it, Alicia, or did you have another question?
That was it for me.
Okay. I had one more, following on something you talked about earlier with respect to these, the training for subcontractors. Is that something that that the individual design teams and you guys initiated for the 8 projects to help, improve their outcomes, obviously? Was there any thought of making them mandatory for a sub to even bid? Which is something that we've talked about a couple of times in the P2P. I mean, you've got this good education. You ain't bidding if you haven't taken it, if you can say that. And are these tested against, or are they just presented?
They're just presented. They're just presented. The best ones are the Stephen Winter series, construction series. And there are different subcategories, like windows, or like they have a whole bunch of, so you wouldn't necessarily as a sub want to have to go to all of them.
Right.
Passive House Mass has tried to think about, could we do like certificates the way that AIA does, or like USGBC? And it's just never, we have one staff person, it's just too much. They're doing too much. I really think there needs to be someone central. And of course, PHI and FIAS fight so much, it's never going to come out of them. So, but we should all talk, because maybe if we can, like, like we did, there's been talks about that, like a GC might be able to accumulate a certain number of hours within their subs by demonstrating, if we added a test at the end. It's just,
it's a good thing. And because I've done a lot of this work in wearing a different hat, but back in the day when I first started this, DuPont was paying for this because Tyvek was complicated to sell and complicated to install. And they had a whole program for their distributors and their subs. And you got paid more if you passed these things and moved up the system. So, it is another aspect of QA QC.
Like Mitsubishi Diamond installers, right? That they have a training program, and you get better warranty if you do a certain amount. But I think it's a heavy lift for any one state or one organization. So maybe we can all combine together and
collectively
figure out how to standardize.
Yeah, that'd be kind of cool. Again, back in the day, Panasonic was doing the same thing for their ventilation fans. But their reward, instead of a discount on your next 10 fans, you got a flat screen from another division of Panasonic. So they had a particularly good incentive program for their people out there. I thought that was an interesting one. All right, so so I think we're well past time, but it was a good thing. If you could stop sharing your screen, Beverly, then we can all applaud you in video real time. So yes, thank you very much. Really excellent. I mean, incredibly thought-provoking. So any other final questions or comments from anybody?
One thing I will say on federal stuff that I think might have some potential, because it's a voluntary program, DOE's Zero Energy Ready. Could we make that into passive?
DOE is on the move. From from my connections with them, they're looking to go big and fast. We've been nosing around whether or not we have this idea I do down at my centers of opportunistic retrofitting, which is sort of a halfway point where you try to make any remodel you're doing as energy efficient as you can. And we've been thinking about promoting that to them, to some of the people within DOE. But from what we're hearing from the labs, they want to do a couple of really big, bold things. And the last thing they did under ARA was they just dumped money into weatherization, and weatherization couldn't handle it. They couldn't spend it efficiently. And because it was stimulus, it sort of didn't matter. You'd like to give money to people to buy pizza. And if they do a better building, that's a nice benefit. But the getting them to buy the pizza is the main thing. And that's mostly what I think that went for, because weatherization, and it wasn't enough, to get to the goals we want to get to. So we're trying to promote that. But I think there's big stuff happening.
DOE also needs to think a little bit more about zero over time. So grabbing the roof replacements, or when a brick masonry building needs to have recladding because it's having water
Yeah,
issues,
she's a keynote.
or like,
She's a
so
keynote.
zero over time, that you get that incremental cost paid for
Yes.
for that upgrade to what we need to get to zero over time, right? So
Yeah, that's what we're talking about on the opportunistic
Right.
side. It's the same thing. We tried to
and
suggest that to Home Depot
electrification
years ago.
ready. So
Yeah.
I would wait on the electrification until we get much better envelopes and we don't have such mismatch between gas and electricity. Like block power scares me because they're over promising, and I just, electrification ready is much more, and the jobs thing on the federal level, it's
Exactly.
not about solar plants. It's about weatherizing every home and using every addition and renovation to upgrade the home to zero, electrification ready. So yeah, sounds like you're on the right
The
track.
problem with it, at the level of buildings, it's a retail, it's out, it's
Yeah,
at the retail level,
I know.
individual stuff, and that gets to be expensive on the admin side. So
Yeah.
it's a game, but anyway. But maybe we can all talk collectively about that, because they're going to do something, and they're looking right now at making some moves. We don't know what they're going to be, but the DOE, the staff that I've gotten to know down there over the last 3 or 4 years is way more impressive than they were 10 years ago. I mean, they're really bright and energetic, and now they're sort of empowered. They want to go out and do stuff. So same at the labs. So
Well,
stuff's going to
there
happen.
is
I'm
a
just not
mass
sure.
save program that I thought had potential, and it's not that administratively difficult, called the Renovations and Additions Program. It was up to, so it's more single family to like mid
Yeah.
4 family, but I think that's a model that could work. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, they pulled the baseline up so high that it's not worth anything. But if you incentivize greenhouse gases without the cap that they had, I think there's potential with that kind of model. So if you ever want to talk about it, give me a call.
Okie dokie. Well, thanks, everybody. This has been great. And we'll see you all in a month.